So I spent a fair amount of time in my travels talking to church people and church leaders, noting a lot of anxiety in churches and church leaders about numerical decline. Over the last number of years, there's been a rise in what's called the nuns. While I was staying in Washington, D.C., in sort of Roman Catholic Central in America, I actually stayed in a Capuchin monastery, and there were, I don't know how many monks in that massive building, maybe 5 or 6. But the rise of the nuns are not like the Roman Catholic nuns, but people who no longer participate in religious institutions and no longer identify according to the religious groups and identities that we've known over the years. This isn't unknown or unseen in the Christian Reformed Church either. The Christian Reformed Church reached its numerical peak in 1992. And I had breakfast with a former pastor of Pleasant Street, my mother's church in Whitensville. We talked a little bit about the history of that church. There are 2 Christian Reformed churches in Whitensville, Pleasant Street and Fairlawn. And Fairlawn was planted when Pleasant Street was up over 1,000 people, and they didn't have room enough in the building for all of the people, and so they spun off another church. And that was pretty common practice in the Christian Reformed Church. Why there were 3 Christian Reformed churches in Rickon, California, now there are 2. A lot of people are anxious about this, and I understand that. One woman who was at the Washington, D.C. conference, we broke out into little estuary groups, and we all have a topic that we can give to the group. And she goes to a mainline church somewhere in Connecticut, and she said, our church is grieving over the loss of the youth and the decline of the church. Here in Northern California, even 30 years ago or 25 years ago when I got here, there were a number of large, healthy Christian Reformed churches in the Bay Area. The Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church, the San Jose Christian Reformed Church, the Walnut Creek Christian Reformed Church, the Hayward Christian Reformed Church, the Alameda Christian Reformed Church. A number of those churches are just about at the verge of asking, can we stay open? A lot of anxiety around churches about the future. Christians have, in some ways, sort of implicitly bought into what I call a subtraction story. The idea is that 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, everyone was Christian and went to church, and this has just all sort of slowly dropped off. Now, there's certain areas of the world where you can see, over hundreds of years, a great decline in church attendance, but the story is usually quite a bit more complex. I had a friend of mine from the UK, Justin Brierley, who used to run a show called Unbelievable, is publishing a book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, writing about a number of the things he sees where we seem to have had a time when people sort of move away from the church a little bit, and now we seem to have a time when some people who are coming back to church, and they're rather surprising who these people are. This is not uncommon if you take a close reading of church history. The influence and power of Christ surges in surprising and quite unexpected places. At the end of the 19th century, there were probably only a few hundred Christians in Korea. By the middle of the 20th century, almost 40% of Koreans were Christian. Churches rise and fall throughout history in surprising ways. And how this happens is usually quite non-linear, let's say. Why do churches flourish and explode at some places, and why do they decline? Christ seems to conquer in very unusual ways. Now, I know it takes a lot to remember, but the last time I preached was 3 weeks ago, and we preached about the riot in Ephesus over the fact that Paul's ministry was having such an impact in that city and the surrounding areas that the merchants that were selling those little figurines of the goddess Diana or Artemis were seeing a downtick in their sales. And they said, if this continues, we're going to lose a lot of money, because the temple, the patron god of the city, Artemis, was becoming less and less popular because people were all talking about this Jesus and this Paul and the resurrection of the dead. A number of months ago, I talked about this book by Bart Ehrmann. Now, it's a very interesting thing to have a Christian Reformed minister talk about a book by Bart Ehrmann. Bart Ehrmann became a Christian as a teenager and decided he wanted to learn more and more about Jesus. So he went to seminary, and then he went to advanced studies, and he lost his faith. And so he has basically made a living writing books about the New Testament from a skeptical perspective. Yet in his book about the triumph of Christianity, what he notes in his book is that Christianity conquered the Roman Empire in about 500 years, mostly on the basis of belief in miracles. And what we saw in Ephesus is, in many ways, sort of a little microcosm of Bart Ehrmann's recollection of how Christianity, in fact, conquered the world. Tom Holland, another historian in his book Dominion, this is the other cover of the book. There's a few different covers of the book. I often use one of them in the sermon titles. But Tom Holland noted that, in fact, Christianity so thoroughly unseated the pagan Roman Empire that temples were, for the most part, abandoned. People wonder, well, the Greeks had those Olympic Games way back in the very early centuries, and why would they stop? The Olympic Games were an interesting sort of pagan festival, and the Olympic Games stopped because nobody bothered with paganism anymore, because so many people were becoming Christians. And Christianity and the ethics of Christ sort of morally rewired the assumptions of the world about what it means to be a good person. And you can see some of this in Acts chapter 19. God did extraordinary miracles through Paul, so that even handkerchiefs and aprons that touched him were taken to the sick, and their illnesses were cured, and the evil spirits left them. Some Jews who were around driving out evil spirits tried to invoke the name of Jesus Christ over those who were demon-possessed. They would say, in the name of Jesus, whom Paul preaches, I command you to come out. At that point, there were plenty of Jesuses around that they had to specify which one they were talking about. 7 sons of Sceva, a Jewish chief priest, were doing this. One day, the evil spirit answered them, Jesus I know, and Paul I know about, but who are you? Then the man who had the evil spirit jumped on them and overpowered them, and gave them such a beating that they ran out of the house naked and bleeding. Now, in a city like Ephesus, word like this would travel through the population, and everybody would wonder and be fascinated, who is this Jesus that this Paul is talking about? When this became known to the Jews and Greeks living in Ephesus, they were all seized with fear. And the name of the Lord Jesus was held in high honor. Many of those who believed now came and openly confessed what they had done. A number who had practiced sorcery brought their scrolls together and burned them publicly. When they calculated the value of the scrolls, the total came to 50,000 drachma. In this way, the word of the Lord spread widely and grew in power. Now, it's really important to remember when you read a text like this, it doesn't mean that there were all these empty churches in Ephesus and suddenly they were all full. There were no church buildings at this point in Christian history. They were meeting in homes, and probably a lot of people were interested in Jesus, and it became something of a fad for a while, and it probably rose and fell as people's attentions were diverted to this and diverted to that. Now, if we jump to chapter 20, after the riot, when the uproar had ended, Paul sent for the disciples and, after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out for Macedonia. And you find this pattern in the book of Acts, that Paul goes into a city and sort of causes an uproar, and then the Christians get together and they say, Paul, things are a little unstable here, and we don't really want people beaten or taken into court. Why don't you go someplace else for a while until things settle down? And in fact, if you think back over into the book of Acts, you have these missionary journeys that Paul would take. And what he started was just a string of cities throughout this area of the Greco-Roman world. And Paul would go into a place and he would preach, and a number of people would start meeting, and those gatherings would sort of continue to grow slowly. But it's helpful to remember that politicians in the Roman Empire didn't pay a lot of attention to Christianity, really, except for these little outbreaks, for a few hundred years. And some of the classical authors that you might learn about if you go to university didn't actually start mentioning Christianity until the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century. It grew slowly in that way. But Paul had a whole string of these little churches around, and as we talked about 3 weeks ago, he was starting to take up a collection, and that collection was going to go back to Jerusalem to help the poor in Jerusalem. He traveled through that area, speaking many words of encouragement to the people, finally arriving in Greece, where he stayed for 3 months, because some Jews had plotted against him. Just as he was about to sail for Syria, he decided to go back through Macedonia. In other words, there were a lot of people that either really liked Paul or really didn't like Paul. And a number of people were plotting his death. If there's something that people really hate, it's a traitor. And certain factions in synagogues thought that Paul was a traitor to the cause, and so plotted his death. And so that sort of rearranged his travel. He had wanted to go down to Syria, which would have been on the way down to Jerusalem, but instead, because of threats on his life, he decided to revisit some of those places that he had been before. He was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus from Berea, Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, Gaius from Derbe, Timothy also, and Tychicus and Trophimus from the province of Asia. Now, in that verse, you might think of this as sort of a random verse. Why would we have these names? When you find names like this dropped into epistles and gospels, and here in the book of Acts, it's done so by the author because the author imagines that the readers of these books will know these people personally and individually. Now, I could name a bunch of people. I could name Christian Reformed ministers like Bill Viss and Matthew Burns, and most of you have never heard of these people. But if I name Jim Van Tholen and Earl Marling, your ears perk up because, well, I knew Jim and I knew Earl. That's exactly why they dropped these names. Now, one of the things that we see is that Paul, in fact, traveled with people. And if you think back about this collection, these are representatives from some of the communities that Paul have planted. And they're carrying the collection with them, and they likely were going to meet Paul and go to Syria and Jerusalem, but Paul changes his mind, and so they all sort of get stuck in Troas, and I'll show you where that is for a minute. But there's another person who's joining them that isn't explicitly named, but if you watch the pronouns, you can see it happen. These men went on ahead and waited for us at Troas. In other words, if you read the book of Acts very carefully, you find first-person pronouns, and you know that Luke, the author of the book, is in the party. And part of the reason the names are in here is because Luke knew these men, and whoever the audience that Luke was writing the book of Acts to, he assumed also knew these men. But we sailed from Philippi after the festival of unleavened bread, and 5 days later joined the others at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. These are all these little details that to us sort of pass over our heads if we're reading this devotionally, but for those who are paying very close attention, historically to this time, it's like, wow, this is gold. We know when and where and why all these people were and what they were doing. We also get another interesting clue that we sailed from Philippi after the festival of unleavened bread, which means Luke was paying attention to the Jewish calendar. These early churches were sort of half Jewish, half Gentile often. And the festivals that they held were, well, kind of one and kind of the other. In the United States, Christian churches will often celebrate Thanksgiving. Is Thanksgiving a holiday you find in the Bible? Does anybody know which president of the United States founded the holiday of Thanksgiving in America? Lincoln. Yeah, I figure more would get it. It was Abraham Lincoln around the time of the Civil War. It's a great crisis in America. Abe Lincoln thought it would be good for us to have a holiday of Thanksgiving in the midst of this national trauma. Now, you won't find Thanksgiving in the Bible, but churches celebrate it. What you see here in the very early church is they're sort of settling things out in terms of what is a church, and what do we do, and how do we celebrate? So Luke, who's likely living in Philippi, may be participating in the house church that Paul founded with Lydia. You can read about that earlier in the book of Acts. And it's very curious that Luke doesn't mention the collection. And this is a question that has bothered scholars for centuries now. We learn about the collection in the book of Romans, in the book of Galatians, in the book of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but Luke barely mentions it, even though this is likely why all these people are together. And we simply have no idea what Luke himself thought of the collection and why he didn't pay attention to it. Because what we're going to see, as eventually we finish the book of Acts, the whole focus on the book of Acts will lead to Jerusalem, and then Paul in prison bearing witness before the rulers of the Roman Empire. But now Troas is where everyone is sort of come together for a week after the festival of unleavened bread. And Luke is with them, and these are direct memories that Luke had of his time with Paul and these other individuals. And then something happens. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. And again, if you're reading this text devotionally, you'll probably think, well, so what? This is actually a really critical thing because it shows very early in the 50s, Christian churches were meeting on Sunday, and what they were doing was this. At the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but also you have Christians getting together. Well, why would they get together on Sunday? Well, what is Sunday? Sunday is the day of resurrection. It's the day Jesus rose from the dead. So they came together the first day of the week, and they came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight. What does that sound like? Preachers love the sound of their voice. And they can sometimes go on and on and on. And Paul is moved by this gathering of people, and he has them all together, and he wants to take advantage, and he wants to teach them. So on and on and on they go. Gathered on the first day of the week, and Paul speaks late into the night. Now, there were many lamps in the upstairs room where they were meeting. They're probably meeting in some person's home, and in this particular town, it was a multi-story house. And they're going on into the night, and they're lighting the room, of course, with lamps, and these are possibly oil lamps or torches. And if you're in a closed space with oil lamps or torches, remember this, in the Dominican Republic, we often use these little kerosene lamps. The whole smell of the room, the smell of what's burning is there. And the room gets a little bit smoky. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus. Now, for us, when we read Eutychus, we think, well, that's a strange Greek name. But actually, anybody reading in this in Greek would know exactly what that name means. It means lucky. This is the young man's name or nickname. He's named Lucky. And we'll soon find out how lucky he is. It was a man named Eutychus who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on into the night. When he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the third story and was picked up dead. Now, why did I talk about Luke? This is not a legend that sort of passed hand to hand. Luke was in the room. Luke was in the building. Luke was there when this thing happened, and this is a tragedy. This young man, who probably a member of one of the households that had gathered at this home to see this famous Paul and to hear him speak, he's sitting in the window because the air in the room is bad, and he falls asleep, and he falls out of the window. Third story, hits the ground, dead. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, put his arms around him. Don't be alarmed, he said, he's alive. Then he went upstairs and broke bread and ate. After talking until daylight, he left. Not only did they go until midnight, have this thing happen, Paul goes down, says, don't worry, he's alive, picks him up, and the people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. News like this will travel fast. It's so matter of fact. It's so spontaneous. It's so ambiguous. People will say, wait, he dropped from that third story, he was killed. Did Paul raise him from the dead? Certainly that's what the text says. And suddenly people's imagination remember Elijah raising the dead. Remember Elisha raising the dead. Remember Jesus raising the dead. Remember the story of Peter and Dorcas. And then suddenly word continues to travel in the area. There's something about these Christians. There's something going on here. And then they break bread together. And then in the morning, Paul leaves. What's interesting is that Paul, who felt what he had to say was so important that he talked all night long, Luke didn't remember or record a word of it. The only thing that gets recorded is this young man falling asleep, falling dead on the pavement, Paul going down, placing himself over, picking him up, the boy is alive and goes home well. We have no idea what Paul said. And news of this travels and then gets recorded by Luke for all of us to read and to know years later. The story is laden with symbolism, which preachers and scholars over the years have picked up on. They're meeting on the first day of the week. They're breaking bread together. This is Resurrection Day. A young man falls to his death. He is restored. Jesus and Lazarus, Peter and Dorcas, now Paul with Eutychus. And what's interesting is that the story is not embroidered at all. It's so matter of fact, sort of like the resurrection accounts of Jesus. These are eyewitness testimonies. Luke was there. And word travels, and people begin to wonder. Now, does that mean that everyone in Troas suddenly becomes a Christian? No. Does that mean that suddenly everything changed in the Roman world? No. But bit by bit, things start to change among the people. This is the way that the Spirit sneaks up on us and does wonders that we don't expect. And this is, in fact, how the gospel conquers in history. It's not by force or coercion, but by love and mercy. Stories that neighbors quietly believe, even though people will say, I don't believe he was dead. Or I don't believe that really happened. Or I don't believe this. Okay. People are still talking, and people are still wondering, and people are still listening, and people are still hoping. Bit by bit, person by person, the Holy Spirit does his surprising work. Now, there's a lot of misery and anxiety over this, and I think that's natural. Of course we're anxious. Of course we wonder, is God going to work? How will things change? Will things be like they used to be? That one's easy. No, they never are. But has God abandoned his word? I don't think so. What Paul has done is built a network of love through these churches. People are loving one another. People are loving the stranger. God's power is manifest in surprising ways that real people believe. There's often some doubt, there's often some skepticism, but it sort of hangs on people. It sort of nags at people. It begins to move them. It waits for its moment. One young man named Lucky was unfortunate enough to host a moment that helped the community believe in God's power to save, to rescue, to redeem, and renew. Was he lucky? Well, you can decide for yourself. But the humble, simple communion that gets begun there begins to grow and to stretch throughout the centuries in very strange ways. I would imagine if any of us could time travel, there would be so many things that we would notice. Differences between us and what happened at Troas, we could hardly pay attention to them all. But what happens is that there's a string of continuity that gets created between now and then. What it focuses on is the breaking of the bread. Well, what is this breaking of the bread? Because pretty much anybody in the Roman Empire, well, bread was sort of a staple. People would eat bread. Well, why would people eat bread? Because you can mass produce grain, and, well, if you've ever just tried to chew on wheat, it's not very wholesome, but in fact, you can grind it into flour, and you can add it with water, and bread is the staple. Everyone in the Roman world is breaking bread, but here on the first day of the week, with all of these people gathered here, Luke mentions we are all gathered together for the breaking of the bread. What does the breaking of the bread mean? It's the self-donation by our God. It's the giving of ourselves to one another. Even if the preacher goes on, and the seats are comfortable, and fortunately nobody has to sit in any windowsills, so if you take a little nap in the middle of the sermon, you just wake up at the end when the preacher's done groaning and everything's okay. God is with us. His kingdom come, his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus' prayer given to us, just like Jesus' meal given to us. Just as in Troas when, well, are we going to bring the collection to Jerusalem, or are we going to go visit those churches? Well, Paul's going a different way, and he seems to want to talk to all these people. But the first day of the week, we're going to get together, and we're going to break bread. And it's not just any other meal. It's a special meal, because they're all remembering together on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. And while they were all celebrating the Seder and expecting the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Jesus said something very strange. While everyone was expecting the usual things that they would say at the Seder, Jesus says, "This is my body, broken for you." And of course, that evening they didn't understand. After they celebrated the Seder, they would go into the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. And then Judas would come with the temple guard and identify Jesus with a kiss. He would be scourged. He would be tried a number of times. And then a robe would be placed on him and a crown of thorns, and he would be led to his execution. On the night he was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it, and he said, "This is my body broken for you." And that breaking and those words and those stories rippled on through the church. So that even the early church was like, are we Jews or are we Christians? Or we don't even know the category, but this is what we do. We rehearse the story. We rehearse it with words. We rehearse it with bread and with wine. And we remember, and when we get together, this is what we do. And so this morning, whether you took a nap as Paul droned on and on, or whether you stayed awake and heard the whole thing, this is what we will do.